Okay. Good Erev Shabbos, Rabbi Sai. Parshas Boy. Great to see everyone. We have amazing material today. Parshas Boy, the Parsha of Yetzias Mitzrayim. I want to take you today to today's email. Please subscribe to our email so you have updates about upcoming Shiurim and events and the Maramakimos for all the Shiurim. If anybody wants to participate in upcoming publications in Be'ezus Hashem, Bereshis Chelek Beis in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Sefer Atzipisa Liyoshua that we're elucidating and translating from the Chafetz Chaim, please join us for that. So we begin with Pesacheinu Megadim. That is connecting the beginning and the end of each Parsha. The Parsha begins, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe boy el Paroi ki ani hichbadti asli b'mesli v'avadav l'man shisi oisai eila b'kirbai Olman tisaper b'aznei v'ncha uven v'ncha es asher salalti b'mitzrayim v'es oisai asher samti ba. The Parsha begins speaking about the oisos. Presumably, I hardened Paro's heart and the heart of his servants, so I could place my signs. Presumably these signs are the makos, the wonders, the miracles. The signs, the wonders, the miracles. The miracles Hashem brought in Egypt. The Parsha ends, V'haya le'ois al yadcha, ki b'chayzek yad hoitzianu Hashem mitzrayim. Presumably that means this ois are not the oisos that God did in Egypt. These are the oisos that we're commanded to fulfill in order to remember the oisos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made. In other words, there are two different oisos. There are the oisos of the opening of the Parsha, and there are the oisos of the end of the Parsha. The oisos that the Parsha begins with are the miracles of Hashem. The oisos of the end of the Parsha are the mitzvahs that we perform to commemorate those miracles that Hashem brought. In fact, the epic words, the famous words of the Ramban at the end of Parshas Boy, because God does not make an ois in every generation, for every wicked person, for every heretic, He commands us that we should always make a zikaron and an ois to what our eyes saw, and that we write down everything that we saw about the oisos and the moivsim, and we write it on our arm and between our eyes. That means that our oisos are to remember the oisos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, how beautiful it is that the chasima of the Parsha is a zikaron for the opening of the Parsha. The ois of Tefillin is a zikaron for the ois of the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim. In the Sefer Degel Machne Ephraim, he deals with why, in the beginning of the Parsha, Leman Shisi, the word Shisi is spelled Chasar. The word Shisi is spelled Chasar, missing a Yud. Why is it missing a Yud? Why is the word Shisi missing a Yud? So the Degel Machne Ephraim says that it could be read Shtei, Hainu Leman Shtei, Oisoisai Eila. What are the two oisos? Shabbos and Tefillin. So it comes out the word Laman Shtei Oisoisai Eila doesn't only refer to the miracles of Mitzrayim. It refers to Tefillin as well. The way the Degel Machne Ephraim reads the pasuk, Laman Shtei Oisoisai Eila Bekirbai, so that I made these miracles in order to give you these two mitzvahs, namely Tefillin and Shabbos. And then it comes out that both in the beginning of the Parsha and the end of the Parsha, it's talking about the ois of Tefillin. So that's another commonality. But then I thought about it more, that actually, that's maybe a way of looking at it b'derech drush. The end of the Parsha is talking about Tefillin, and we could darshan the ois in the beginning of the Parsha is talking about Tefillin as well. But actually, al derech hapshat, not only is the beginning of the Parsha simply referring to the miracles of Egypt, at the end of the Parsha, when it says v'haya lecha le'ois al yadcha, the ois is not going on the tefillin, and I never really picked up on this. The Gemara says the ois is going on tefillin. Our tefillin is an ois, right? I'm sure you've heard. Shabbos is an ois, and that's why we don't have to wear tefillin on Shabbos, because Shabbos is an ois, and tefillin is an ois. Ois hi beini uveinechem. Did you know that Rashi says on the pasuk, v'haya lecha le'ois al yadcha, v'haya lecha le'ois yitzias mitzrayim tia lecha le'ois. The Exodus will be for you as a sign on your arm. The ois is not going on tefillin. The ois is going on Yitzias Mitzrayim. That the miracle of Yitzias Mitzrayim will be on your arm. How? Through the tefillin. But the ois is not the tefillin. The ois is the miracle of Yitzias Mitzrayim. And in that case, both the ois at the beginning of the pasuk and the end of the pasuk, and at the beginning of the parsha and the end of the parsha, is going on the miracles of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Now, another interesting thing that hit me. The parsha begins, Olaman tisaper ba'aznei bincha uven bincha, that the purpose of the miracles is so that you talk about the miracles that Hashem made. Tisaper, the purpose is Laman tisaper. At the end of the parsha, also, it says, Laman tieh toiras Hashem beficha, that you talk about it. And in the very last pasuk, also, I never realized this before. V'haya la'ois al yadcha ula taita fais beineinecha. Does anybody know, what does the word taita fais mean? So Rashi brings two explanations. Either Rashi says tat in Caspian is 2, and pat in African is 2. So toita fais means 4, and that refers to the 4 compartments of the tefillin. But then Rashi brings Menachem, who says the word toita fais comes from the pasuk vehatef el daraim, al titfu. It's a lashon of dibur, like ulazikarain beineinecha, that if somebody sees the tefillin tied between your eyes, he'll remember the miracle and he'll speak about it. So then both the beginning of the parsha and the end of the parsha refer to speaking about the miracles of Hashem. The parsha begins Laman Tisaper, and the parsha ends Toita Fais, which means Dibor. Now this one I spent some time on, and I think it's very interesting. At first I wanted to so to speak, highlight the following connection. The parsha begins, Laman tisaper ba'aznei bincha uben bincha. You should speak to your child and your grandchild. And the end of the parsha also says, v'higadata lebincha, or v'haya ki yishalcha bincha machar. So, at first I wanted to establish the following connection, namely, that the parsha begins and ends with telling your children. But then I realized it's not exactly parallel, because the parsha begins, Laman tisaper ba'aznei bincha uben bincha. Parsha begins so you tell your child and your grandchild, and it ends only about telling your child. So, number one, it's a bit of a contradiction. And number two, did you know the Torah never talks about teaching your grandchildren? All it talks about is your children. And that question is asked in a very interesting sefer. It's called Balei Bris Avram. Balei Bris Avram, of Rabbi Avram Azulai, the great-great-grandfather of the Chidah. And the Balei Bris Avram says, well, what the Torah is getting at is that if you're telling your children's children, then they must be really young, these children's children. So it emphasizes children's children to say that when you teach your children, it's not only if they're like 15 years old or 10 years old, it's even if they're very young. However, I would like to do something else with this. If you look in the Sefer Panim Yafos of the Hafla, he says that when the Torah says "Aman tesaper ba'oznei bincha uben bincha," it doesn't mean you teach your grandchildren. After all, the Torah at the end of the parsha says "V'higadata lebincha." Laman tesaper ba'oznei bincha uben bincha means you should teach your children in such an indelible way. You should make such a deep impression upon them that they will in turn teach their children. There's no mitzvah to teach the grandchild. The mitzvah is to teach the child in a way, tell the child about Yetzias Mitzrayim in such a way that he will relay it to his child. Like, in other words, you want to tell your child, not tell your child and your grandchild, tell your child that your child will tell his child. Shegam hu yisaper levnai. Like it says, v'higadata lebincha leimar. What's the leimar? Tell your child that he should tell his child. Like David HaMelech says, l'man yedu dar achroin banim yivoldu yakumu v'sapru levneihem. Also the Chassam Sofer also writes this explanation, that the zechus of Yetzias Mitzrayim is in the merit of us telling our children, that so they grow up and tell their children, and that this way will fulfill Aman tesaper ba'oznei bincha uben bincha. So this is an example, I like to say, of we need the end of the parsha to understand the beginning of the parsha. If we just had the beginning of the parsha, you would think Laman tesaper ba'oznei bincha uben bincha means teach your child and your grandchild. We come to the end of the parsha where it only says child, and it says the word leimar. That reveals that in the beginning of the parsha, the mitzvah is not to teach the child and the grandchild. From the fact that at the end of the parsha it just says "V'higadata lebincha," it must be in the beginning of the parsha, "Laman tesaper ba'oznei bincha uben bincha." That means tell your child in such a eternal, indelible way that he will then give over to his child. So this is a case where the end of the parsha reflects upon the meaning of the beginning. Okay, that is segment number 1.